Hey everyone. We'll be getting started on our next live review session here in a few minutes, but I wanted to get started here in case anyone is around and paying attention. We'll hang out here for a couple more minutes and see who all is showing up, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Alrighty, you guys take it easy. Bye. Oh, if you have any questions, don't put them in the chat on the side. Instead, put them in the forum because there I can see them there. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. A minute early, but everyone else can join in when they get here. So welcome to a session of online review, and we hope that if you have any questions, you'll post them in our forum, not in the chat bar on the side, but in the forum, so that we can answer those questions. That's the place where we are able to see the messages rather than in the chat bar on the side. So just make sure you put your questions there. So I think that I'll start today talking about politics. If there's something else you want me to go over, just let me know and we can move on from there. And so with politics, I wanted to start with talking about types of government. And government, I want unitary government is one where the central government controls everything. They may delegate some authority to other parts of the country, but they aren't truly sharing power because they can take that power away from those people at any time. It's really just a delegation, not a true giving up of power. Federalism, on the other hand, is when there's a true sharing of power between the central and the local government. And in what we see is two types of federalism. So the first type of federalism is symmetrical federalism. And this is a case where you have subunits to the central government. Like in the US's case, we have the central government and then we have the state governments. And every state government has the same power as other state governments. And the federal government can't go in and take those powers away easily. So that's the true sharing of power. We even see it shared down further from the state government to the local municipalities, although that tends to, we do tend to see in those cases that there is a little more difference in the power that some municipalities have versus other municipalities. In terms of asymmetric federalism, then what you see is the subunits have different levels of power. So this is where you might have a special economic zone or something like that that has different powers than does another zone within the country. And the central government can go in and make changes to the power that people have, but they can't just take it away completely. It's not just delegated power. It is actually given up to those areas. So if we think about Canada, for example, they are an example of asymmetric federalism. So certain territories within Canada have different powers than other territories within Canada. And so that's the example. China becomes really interesting. China, some people look at it as asymmetrical federalism because they have things like special economic zones. And some people look at it as unitary because the central government can pretty much change anybody's power that they want to. And it is more of a delegation of power than a true sharing of power. Then some other interesting things that we want to talk about in terms of politics. We have enclaves versus exclaves. An enclave is when you have a piece of territory that your country surrounds a piece of territory. So you can kind of think of it like, you know, a donut, and the donut hole is the enclave. So your territory completely surrounds another territory. This would be something like Vatican City is an enclave within Italy. Lesotho is an enclave within South Africa. And so those are pieces of territory that are completely enclosed by a surrounding country, but aren't part of that country. And that creates some problems for those particular areas. And you can imagine that if South Africa wanted, they could make life very, very difficult for Lesotho. And that's a problem that all enclaves have. An exclave is when you have a piece of your country that is not attached to the rest of the country. So taking the U.S., for example, exclave of the now, an entry can place. And that, of course, can create some difficulties and tensions between countries when your territory is kind of stuck in the middle of somebody else's territory. Those are the kinds of things that can lead to ideas of irredentism. And irredentism is when someone wants to expand the territory of the state usually because they feel the territory of the nation exceeds the state. So remember when we talked about multi-state nations, where the territory of the nation goes onward. Well, this is a case where the territory of the nation is in a state, but also is expanded. So when we look prior to World War II, Hitler, for example, really pushed irredentism for this idea of getting all Germans everywhere into one greater Germany. And he talked about that a lot. And so enclaves can lead to irredentism, the nation, and that's for all of your people inside your state. Let's talk a little bit about boundaries. We can categorize boundaries in a variety of ways. Of course, the first category is the type. And so the type of boundary that we can talk about, geometric versus physical. Geometric boundaries are usually drawn as straight lines on maps. And in this case, you may see things like being drawn along latitude or longitude lines is the most common. So if we look at the US and you look at the western states in the US, you'll see lots of squares. Those are all geometric boundaries. They were drawn based on latitude and longitude lines usually, and or at least, basically someone took out a ruler and drew on a map in order to give those areas their shape. Physical boundaries, on the other hand, tend to go along, physical features, rivers, mountains, lakes, whatever. And they tend to, therefore, if you're looking on a map, they tend to be all squiggly. So if you have squiggly lines, most likely physical. If you have straight lines, most likely geometric. Two big categories. Our next way of categorizing boundaries is how they were drawn. So if we look at a boundary that already existed before the people moved into the area, that is something that we call an antecedent boundary. And an antecedent boundary just means before, the folks were living there, before the cultural landscape was developed. A subsequent boundary is one that was developed after the cultural landscape already was in place and may have been drawn, in fact, to work with the cultural landscape. And so if you had two different groups living in an area and they, developed differently in different habits and languages and things like that, the boundary may be drawn between them. That's a subsequent boundary. It was drawn to take into account what we have there. A superimposed boundary, on the other hand, does not take into account usually those cultural differences. And they'll usually be drawn for somebody else's desire. So our subsequent boundary could have been drawn by either of our groups, that we drew the boundary between. They could have been involved in that. A superimposed is going to be drawn by somebody else. So we really look at Africa often as our example of this because of the colonial intervention in Africa and the way that the European countries especially basically went in and carved Africa and did about the ethnic groups they were dividing or the ethnic groups they were throwing together and the different cultural landscapes that already existed. They just cared about the territories they could claim and what was convenient to them. So this then created a lot of problems for Africa today. The landlocked states we see, the ethnic tensions within certain countries, the problems of displacement, all of those things can be traced back to all of those superimposed boundaries that in many cases created fairly unworkable states or states that struggle to function as a normal state. From there, let's move on to some models and talk about some political and economic, because we were really going to want to blend those two things together a lot, and talk about those models. So one of the things that we want to talk about is the difference between a liberal model and a structuralist model. So a liberal model is one that says every country in the world can develop to the same place. So if country actually get up to the same level as country B, that's a liberal model. A structuralist model says country A is here, country B is here, and country A is never ever going to get up to here because of the structure of the world and the world economic and political policy and the way that things actually work, this gap will never be closed. Even if this country starts to rise, this country up here is rising too, and so they're just going to keep on going, and country A can never reach the same level as country B. Our main liberal model is Rostow's modernization model, where he said that countries go through basically 5 stages on the way to being a highly industrialized mass consumption society. And the first of those stations is your traditional economy. So this is where we're looking at most of the positions, inherited land, all of those kinds of things. And so that you have that very traditional system. Then you have your preconditions for takeoff. You've invested more in the country, perhaps another country invested in that country, and so they're setting them up for being able to develop out of that traditional economy and lifestyle. Then we move into takeoff, where they're, basically the economy is growing greatly. We get up to the drive to maturity, and so this is where we're really seeing the country start to diversify more, and so we're going to have more and more stuff going on in the country economically and politically, that they're going to open up politically. And finally, they get to that mass consumption, that highly capitalized society. And then we have our structuralist models, like I said, that say, no, that's not going to happen. One of those is the core periphery model, which says the world is divided into a core and then a periphery. If you look at the world from a North Polar projection, then you can kind of see that most of the world, which is in the northern hemisphere, kind of clusters around, and most of that is the core. Then you go outward from there and you get the periphery. Now, there are definitely some exceptions to this. Australia, for example, is counted as part of the core, even though they are, by that polar projection, out there in the periphery. Then we have the semi-periphery, which kind of falls in between those two. And these are considered to be countries that could be on the move from periphery to core, or they're just kind of in the middle there. And so they share some characteristics of the core countries and some characteristics of the periphery countries. Wallerstein and his world systems theory is basically the same idea, dividing the world into these categories, and that the categories don't substantially change. The dependency theory says that the core countries, these richer countries, want to deliberately keep poor. You don't help, if you don't provide stuff to them anymore, because you've developed to the point where you now have your own economy and your own industrial facilities, and you're producing for your own and you're selling your own stuff, that's really not very beneficial to the rich countries. And so they are going to try to keep you to the point that you will remain a benefit to them. It's kind of an outgrowth of mercantilism. When we go back to the idea of the colonial countries creating these areas in order to benefit them economically, this is what the same kind of idea is. They want to keep the poorer countries poor because that's more of a benefit to them. If any of you guys have any questions, this is a good time to post them in the forum so that we can carry on and discuss things. Going to talk a little bit about agriculture. So we have various types of agriculture, commercial versus subsistence. And agriculture is, of course, sorry, I'm going to take a little detour here. Agriculture is, of course, a primary activity. So if we take a look at our types of economic activity, we have primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and quinary. So primary is basically taking stuff out of the land. If you take stuff off the earth, farming, aquaculture, lumber, mining, any of that, fishing in general, not just aquaculture, but fishing, all of those things are extractive industries, and therefore they are primary. Now, I like to give In primary, we're going to take stuff out of the land, whatever that is. And then in the secondary, this is our manufacturing level. And so we're going to now take that stuff we took out of the land and make something with it. And then tertiary is our service, retail, things like that. And so at that point, we are going to sell the stuff that we made in order to, you know, make a profit off of the stuff that we originally took out of the land and made stuff with. And then in quaternary, we're going to start doing some research on what we had. We're going to start looking at better ways of managing it. We're going to kind of try to understand what we're doing. And then quinary, we're talking at the very, very, very top levels of management. So these are our CEOs, CFOs, but the very, very highest level of management is what we're talking about when we get to the quinary level. All right, so that little detour aside, let's go back to agriculture. We have two main types of agriculture, and those types are going to be commercial and subsistence. So commercial agriculture, of course, is when you are growing things to make a profit. Your goal in growing things is to sell them. You may consume a few of them, but you are not really producing to feed yourself. And you can see that, you know, if all you produce is corn, you know, and that's all you are making, then you're obviously not just eating corn. So you're not producing in order to feed yourself and your family. Our subsistence level farmers generally are going to have more diversification of what they make. They may have livestock and a crop or something like that, mainly because you need to eat more, you know, and so you're going to, with subsistence level farming, you're going to be producing to feed yourself and your family. If you have any surplus, you may be able to trade or barter it, or you may be able to save it for a rainy day, depending on what it is, but you're not going to be producing in order to make a profit. So Von Thunen, for example, doing commercial farming. According to Von Thunen, there is no subsistence level farming in his model. And then, let's see, generally when we look at the difference in types of farming between more developed countries and less developed countries, our more developed countries are generally going to all be commercial farming. We're going to have almost no subsistence level farming at all in more developed countries, in large part because most of the farming is going to take place with agribusiness and large corporations rather than family farms. You may have in a few places, like if we look at the indigenous people living in Canada, there may be some subsistence level farming there. The same thing with the northern reaches of Scandinavia, that kind of thing with pastoral nomadism there. But almost all of it is going to be commercial farming. Whereas in LDCs, you're going to have both commercial and subsistence level farming. But the commercial farming is going to be different than the commercial farming is in MDCs. So the commercial level farming in LDCs is going to often be plantation style farming. And this is when you're going to have foreign owned areas with labor intensive products, and most of the profit from it is going to leave that area and go somewhere else. And then you'll have the subsistence level farming where people are going to farm for themselves and maybe have a little extra. Another way that we can categorize farming is intensive versus extensive farming. Intensive farming being that you put a lot into the land. So either a lot of labor or a lot of money or a lot of inputs or whatever, but you do a lot to that piece of land in order to get a lot out of the land. Extensive farming, on the other hand, is when you don't put a lot into the land, but you use a lot of land. So in commercial farming, a good example of extensive is ranching. All right, each cow uses a lot of land. Okay, in subsistence level farming, slash and burn or swidden is a good example of extensive farming, because each person, as they farm, they're going to continue using more and more and more land, and so it's a very extensive use of the land. Intensive we can see in market gardening and commercial farming. That's going to be fairly intensive. You know, growing tomatoes or something like that is going to be very intensive. Whereas we can look at intensive rice cultivation or something like that in LDCs as another example of intensive farming. Okay, there don't seem to be any questions today. Nobody is posting any. So if there aren't any questions, then we are probably going to draw this to a close. And you know, we can pick up again on Wednesday with another review session, and there will be another chance to ask questions. But if you have them, please put them up and we will be happy to answer them. I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes just in case they want to throw some questions up. You know, if you don't have a specific question, but you just want me to talk about a particular topic, you know, you can throw that up, say, hey, talk about population or talk about politics or whatever it is. We just want to make sure that we are covering things that are useful to you and not just, you know, blathering on about whatever we want to talk about. We want to make sure the topics we are covering are useful to you. So if there's a topic that you want to hear about, please tell us. If you don't have a particular question right now, but you come up with one in the next day or so, then throw it on the forum for the Wednesday session, and we will be happy to get to it then. All right, so I'm going to go check the forum again real quick, see if anyone has come up with anything. All righty, transferring data, etc. Alrighty, so still no questions, so we're going to go ahead and draw this one to a close. And if you have topics you want covered and that you want to hear about, then let us know, and we will happily cover them on Wednesday or our next weekend review session, which we'll figure out when it is, you know, sometime later this week, and we'll send out an email and let you all know. So on that note, hope you guys are having a good evening. You can, you know, drop us a line and let us know what you're thinking about everything, and we look forward to it. Take it easy. Bye-bye.